Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Ian Hitchcock from VNRC here. We're going to give folks another couple of minutes to sign on, and then we will get started.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Please let us know if you have any technical difficulties hearing us. But in the absence of that, we're gonna look forward to spending an hour with you. I'm Johanna Miller. I'm the Energy and Climate Program Director at the Vermont Natural Resources Council. I'm joined today by Ben Edgerly Walsh of VPIRG and Lauren Heirl of the Vermont Conservation Voters. And we're looking forward to spending, as I said, the next hour with you all, looking to provide a little bit of context in terms of where we stand on progress related to clean energy and climate, reflecting back on the 2019 legislative session, both on what happened, some successes, and what didn't, in terms of doing what we need to do to reduce our reliance on climate warming fossil fuels. So at the end of the session, we will have time for questions, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as possible. So please submit your questions or your comments via the chat bar on the right-hand side of your screen. And so before we dig in and reflect on what happened and what, and some context and thoughts on why and where we stand, we just wanted to start with some sorry about that, a little bit of context. First, many of you have probably seen this slide, but we believe it's an important framework to continue to keep at the forefront of our minds as we talk about clean energy climate progress in Vermont. And because this is the metrics that we have to measure progress by. And those metrics come in three forms. First, our statutory greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, which were enshrined in law in 2006. These goals set a target for 80 to 95% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. We have a 90% by 2050 total renewable energy goal. That goal is for both heating, transportation, and electricity. That is reflected in our comprehensive energy plan. And we have the commitment that we made as a state when President Trump announced his plans to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement, leaving us singularly as the only nation in the world not participating in this global accord. But Vermont has long stepped up and said, we're gonna take action on climate, not only because of the urgency of the issue, but also because of the opportunity. What this graph shows, however, is that we're failing to make progress towards all three of these important commitments. You can see the trajectory that we're currently on at the top of the screen in the blue. That shows our rising greenhouse gas emissions, and you can look at the lines in terms of marking the progress that we should have or need to be making in the trajectory that we need to get to towards 2050. So again, as you can see, and as you are likely well aware, there is a giant gap between where we stand, what we've committed to, and how far we have to go. And that's where we want to focus this conversation today and continue having conversations and partnering with you as we look forward. So again, just to contextualize, to meet these goals, again, supported by our governor, most all legislators, the vast majority of Vermonters, a lot more progress is required. This slide is from our partners at the Energy Action Network and their 2018 annual report, which gives us a sense of the scale of what is needed to put us on a path to the first target, which is the 2025 commitment in the Paris Climate Accord. To get there, again, to just give you a sense of scale, we're going to need to do something on the order of the following over the next 6 years. 90,000 additional electric vehicles replacing internal combustion cars. Right now, we currently have about 2,800, 3,000 EVs in Vermont. We're going to need something of the scale of 90,000. 25,000 homes and buildings switching from fossil fueled heating systems to advanced wood heat. 90,000 additional homes and buildings receiving energy efficiency retrofits. Currently, we're just about 26,000 having been retrofitted. 90,000 additional homes and buildings moving away from fossil fuel heating systems to heat pumps, and 90,000 additional homes and buildings replacing fossil fueled water heaters with heat pump water heaters or something of the sort. So, again, that just is intended to give you a sense of the scale of what's going to be required. And this is just to be illustrative. It is not meant to be prescriptive. But I think it sort of frames the magnitude of what we need to be doing. But also just to contextualize it, for example, when it comes to electric vehicles, there are approximately 44,000 new vehicles purchased in Vermont every year. If that sales rate stays stable over the next 6 years, that would be about 264,000 total new vehicles sold in that time period. So about 1 out of every 3 Vermonters making a new vehicle purchase in the next 6 years opted for an EV, we could actually meet those goals. Importantly, and you'll hear more about it from Ben and Lauren, the legislature did take steps to pave the pathway for more Vermonters availing themselves of not only electric vehicles, but for those who can't afford an electric vehicle to more fuel-efficient hybrid vehicles to help low-income earners access more efficient, clean vehicles. So again, this is just to give you a sense of the scale. And then just to contextualize, again, what we all know, but really important frame, and that's just to highlight the urgency of the issue. As you probably well aware, may have very well read, last year the IPCC put out their report, putting a finer point on the science that they've been telling us for years, that the world is warming rapidly and without unprecedented action across all sectors of society. In fact, cutting fossil fuel use in half by 2030, then we are going to face serious climate, social, economic climate disruption. So pretty stark reminder. Similarly, the UN released its emissions gap report last year, saying that governments must triple their ambition if we're to achieve the goals of the Paris Climate Accords. And then as well, the National Climate Assessment came out, which is a product of over 12 federal agencies, rolled out the day after Thanksgiving last year by the Trump administration, while many of you might have been enjoying your holiday leftovers. But this report really detailed the serious risks of inaction, citing many specific ramifications region by region. So again, we know this stuff. It's why you are on this webinar today. It's why you're working so hard in your roles, professionally, personally, caring deeply about this issue. But again, the reality is we've got to get serious. And in the last year, last couple of years, the last year in particular, there seemed to be a real consensus around that here in Vermont, and real momentum behind significant action. Just a few examples to highlight quickly. 2017, Governor Scott established a 21-member Climate Action Commission, tasked it with delivering recommendations for putting us on a path towards meeting our climate commitments. Last summer, the commission delivered those recommendations, offering potential pathways for progress. It seemed like a real opportunity for the governor and his team to step in and drive those recommendations forward. As you'll hear more specifically later, there was some progress towards those goals that the legislature really helped advance in particular, but not nearly enough. It is still our hope, though, that there is momentum here. But shortly after that, though, excitingly, the 2018 election ushered in a new slate of leaders who care deeply about taking action on climate and who ran on making progress in our transition to more efficient, clean local energy. That was a top core priority for many. Over 40 new legislators came to Montpelier this January, bringing needed passion for job-creating, equitable approach to tackling climate. It was great to see. It's an important foundation from which to build. Pictured here is Manchester Representative Kathleen James, who's deeply committed to these issues. And it's folks like Kathleen, Representative James, and others who I think sort of speak to the opportunity for greater progress next year and beyond. So, but for this past session, again, there was a lot of hope for serious progress. Large part reflected in the leadership of the youth of Vermont, student leaders who organized tirelessly over the course of the last session, bringing their voice into the legislature. On the first day of the session, hundreds of youth from across the state came to the State House. They held a press conference, as you can see here on the left-hand side of your screen, asking legislators, the state, to step up and get serious about those commitments that we know we hold. But they didn't stop there. Later in the session, they testified before committees of jurisdiction. They met with legislative leadership. Almost 1,000 of them came out again for their annual Youth Lobby Day in May. Each of these efforts by these inspiring young people were intended to, I think, frame from their perspective the cost of inaction. These are the folks that will be paying the greatest cost from doing too little too late and failing to really be committed to our climate goals. And they were dogged and inspiring. And as well, there was also a strong coalition of groups who put forward a cohesive, ambitious, but ultimately what we thought was a still pragmatic agenda for progress in 2019. It included the 3 organizations hosting this webinar, but it was far more than that as well. It represented organizations including low-income advocates, business leaders, affordable housing organizations, public health professionals, social justice and faith leaders, environmental organizations, and more. And in this picture, we stood shoulder to shoulder with Senate President Pro Tem Tim Ashe at a press event in January, rolling out again an agenda that we believed was intended to balance the urgency of the issue, but also recognizing, some of the real limitations of democracy that are, do provide some sort of, again, limitations to truly being bold. But so it was our hope that these were pragmatic, doable, but ultimately achievable goals from the last legislative session. It included doubling the number of low-income, moderate income homes weatherized every year, creating an electric vehicle incentive program that prioritized low and middle income Vermonters. Specifically, we called for using the $4.5 million from a state consumer protection settlement from the Volkswagen and other automobile fraudulent activity and directing that to such a program. We asked for enacting a Global Warming Solutions Act, an accountability framework to require progress on our goals. We wanted the state to look at the decarbonization study that the Climate Action Commission of the governors asked for, that the legislature funded, that did a deep analysis of a potential economy-wide policy that could serve Vermont well in terms of reducing emissions in a way that could work well for our economy and the most vulnerable among us. We also asked for prohibiting the deployment of new large-scale fossil fuel infrastructure and continuing to make progress towards towards building a more local renewable energy portfolio. Those are 6 of the priorities that this 25-member organizational coalition put forward. There was some progress in these arenas, and I'm gonna turn it over now to Ben Edgerly Walsh from VPIRG to give you more specificity in terms of where we landed related to these goals and some other important progress to be celebrated related to these issues this past session. Ben.
Thanks so much, Joey. So I'm just going to go through a few of the key asks that we had this legislative session, the progress we made, the progress we didn't, and then, as Joey said, touch on a couple of other things that weren't explicitly part of our agenda, that we're not in this list of 6 items, but we're still climate action nonetheless. So first off, before I dive into the specifics of weatherization and electric vehicles, I do want to be clear that while there were hearings on the Global Warming Solutions Act concept, which if you're not familiar with it, Joey, you'll get a little bit more into it later, but basically is taking our goals and putting them in law and requiring action on them from the state government. Some hearings on the decarbonization study, banning of fossil fuel infrastructure. There was a public hearing that went very well. Over 100 people attended, and virtually everyone who spoke in favor of it. But none of those things actually saw action. And so we'll be talking more towards the end of the webinar about sort of next steps and where we go from here. But things that we did actually see action on. So our ask was doubling the number of low and moderate income homes weatherized every year. That would, based on our analysis and that of some of our allies, would have taken about $11 million of additional ongoing funding every year going forward. And that would be a mix of homes weatherized through the low-income weatherization program, which is a full subsidy, fully paid for the lowest income Vermonters, and subsidies and incentives and financing for moderate income Vermonters who don't qualify for that weatherization program. What the legislature actually did was instead put $4.5 million in new funding into those 2 categories. But almost all that money was what's considered one-time money that is available this coming budgetary year, but absent additional legislative action next year would not reoccur in the future. And so while what they did was about 40% of the ask, it was really 40% of 1 year of what had been an ask that would have gone on into the future. So far short of what was really needed. That being said, 1,400 roughly Vermont families are going to see weatherization that wouldn't have otherwise seen it. That's a positive step. It is, quote, moving in the right direction, as it were, but moving in the right direction far too slowly from an actual climate standpoint. The other thing I'll mention here is the Public Utilities Commission will, due to legislation H63, have a proceeding going forward looking at the future of energy efficiency and electrification in Vermont, looking at the work Efficiency Vermont's doing, some of the work the utilities are required to do under the Renewable Energy Standard to get Vermonters off fossil fuels outside the electric sector, and actually figure out, is that enough to actually accelerate us towards our goals? I think the objective answer is no, but the PUC will look into that question. And then if not, where do we go from here and how do we fund that additional work? So that's something that organizations are definitely going to be diving into and will hopefully result in legislative action in the future. On electric vehicle incentives, our ask was that the legislature put all $4.5 million that the state had received from Volkswagen and other vehicle pollution settlements in the last year or so into a new electric vehicle incentive, in particular for low to moderate income Vermonters. The legislature ultimately put $1.1 million into that kind of a program, plus another $900,000 into other vehicle incentives. Some of that $900,000 is going to incentives for Vermonters to get into more fuel efficient vehicles that are not electric vehicles, so hybrids or other high mileage vehicles. And some of it's going into a vehicle repair program for people who have older cars whose emission systems are failing. So definitely, again, short of even the modest ask that we had put on the table going into the session. But still something that we can build on in future years. One additional thing that was not explicitly called out in that list of 6, but is sort of encapsulated in the ask around, advancing the ball on renewable energy, is a small bill that will make it easier for schools to go solar, or put another way, allow schools to do more solar than they would have been able to do prior to this legislation. So right now the cap on a school is a 500 kilowatt system. You're looking at the St. Albans, high school, I think, but school in St. Albans, and that's roughly a 500 kilowatt system on the roof that you see there. So that is right now the most a school district really could do. And so especially as you see school districts merge due to recent legislation, more and more schools are running into this cap and not able to actually meet all of their needs with renewable energy, in particular solar. So the legislature took action on that and actually doubled that cap to 1 megawatt. Again, this is sort of a chipping around the edge thing. We do see it as a positive step, but is not going to substantially accelerate the progress that we are as a state moving towards renewable energy. Now, 2 other things that were not on the list that Joey and I went through. One, there was a bill S30 on something called hydrofluorocarbons, or HCFCs. These are super potent greenhouse gases that are used in very small amounts, but pound for pound, they're 1,000 times, 2,000, 3,000 times as potent as CO2 as a greenhouse gas, far more potent even than methane, which I'm sure a number of you have heard about. They're used for air conditioning, refrigeration, a number of other things. And the problem that this legislation is attempting to be part of solving is there was an international agreement that the Obama administration was part of to substantially curb the usage of these and move to safer alternatives. That regulations that the Obama administration put forward under that have largely been rolled back by the Trump administration. And so this legislation puts in place more stringent requirements in the coming years, building on some work that ANR had already been doing. And then the last thing that I'll mention before I turn it over to Lauren is S113, a bill to start tackling the problem of single-use plastic pollution. So this is something that we have not primarily approached as climate legislation. And just to be really clear, if the millions of plastic bags that we're talking about Vermonters using every year, that's not included in the tally of Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions that you've probably heard about, going up that Joey referenced at the beginning of the webinar. This is sort of over and above the climate pollution that we're directly responsible for in the energy and waste and agricultural sectors. But the reason I bring it up as a climate piece here is when you look globally at the problem of plastic pollution, you have a couple of key trends. So one, on the left side here, you'll see the total million tons of plastic produced every year from 1950 up to 2015. As you can see, our use of plastic is going through the roof, and there's no sign of it stopping. There's actually a very clear picture of the fossil fuel industry looking at plastics and other chemicals as an alternative to burning fossil fuels so that they can keep making the kind of profits that they're used to making. And the bottom of that chart there, that pink piece, that single-use plastic packaging. It is both the largest part of plastic production globally and the part of plastic pollution that is used for the smallest amount of time. So the average lifespan of that plastic packaging is 6 months. This is according to an analysis that National Geographic published recently. And as you know, many of those pieces of packaging are used for far, far less than that. So the other thing is what you see on the right, because plastic usage is accelerating so rapidly. By 2050, just the fossil fuel extraction, production, and disposal of plastics could be or will be equivalent to 600 coal-fired power plants operating continuously around the world. That could actually account for about 10% of our global carbon budget going forward. And that is a huge problem, because basically what it means is that even if we get everything right in the energy sector and the agricultural sector, if we don't tackle plastic pollution, we are still not solving the climate crisis. And so S113, which banned plastic shopping bags, polystyrene, plastic stirrers, and made straws available only upon request going forward, is a really nation-leading law or bill. Hopefully the governor signs it and it becomes law that will really advance the ball in the fight against plastic pollution, which is clearly important over and above the core work we're doing on climate. So the last thing that I want to wrap with is just kind of putting, in particular, the weatherization and electric vehicle actions that the legislature took in the context of those 2025 needs that Joey talked about earlier. Again, for weatherization and electric vehicles, we need to do 90,000 more weatherization jobs between now and 2025, and we need to get 90,000 more electric vehicles on the road. So you can see the current pace weatherization between now and 2025. We're going to do about 12,000 more weatherization jobs. And this year, they added about 1,400 more, about 10% more jobs to what we're going to be doing in the next 6 years. So relative to that 90,000, again, far, far short of what is actually necessary to get back on track to hit our goals. Similarly, on electric vehicles, at the current pace, we're seeing Vermonters buy about 600 electric vehicles a year. That would result in about 3,500 new EVs on the road in the next 6 years. And the funding that the legislature put on the table, that 1.1 million, is only going to get a few hundred more electric vehicles out there. So on both of these things, the numbers are crystal clear. While we might be moving in the right direction, we're doing so slowly that we're not actually going to get back on track to hit our own climate commitments. And so, again, we're going to talk a little bit about going forward, how we actually, as our three organizations, see Vermont actually getting back on track so that we can ultimately hit those climate commitments, do our part to help solve the climate crisis, and hopefully actually within the next couple of years help set an example for other states about what really can be done on climate.
Great. Thank you, Ben. So this is Lauren Heirl with Vermont Conservation Voters, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about the political lay of the land and where we go from here. And starting off, just wanted to note that in the environmental field beyond climate, we actually had some good wins this year. Clean water funding, something we've been pushing for years, put in place a big state investment in that. It'll be ongoing about $12 million a year. There were some nation-leading bills on toxic chemicals and others. So a lot of what we're talking about is really specific to what's happening on climate change and where are some of the barriers and what can we be doing as a collective group who cares about these issues to really change the political dynamic so that we can have bigger nation-leading wins like we're actually seeing on some of the other issue areas that we work on. So, all of us on this webinar know the urgency of acting on climate change, underscored with the recent reports, as Joey was discussing, looking at, a decade or so to dramatically reduce our greenhouse gases and these other calls to action. Vermont Conservation Voters did a lot of work in the elections, and we were really excited by the number of folks running on pro-climate platforms. People who work in the clean energy sector were choosing to run for office. A lot of people who had for years been activists in climate were running. So there was a huge amount of energy, excitement, enthusiasm around climate as a key election issue. And ultimately, pro-climate candidates won big on election night in November 2018. And this was true not just in Chittenden County or certain parts of the state. We were seeing this hold true across rural parts of the state, in moderate districts, in districts where people were running against candidates who were running aggressive, negative, anti, quote unquote, carbon tax campaigns against them. And in district after district, we saw this really positive outcome where candidates running on climate action platforms won seats to the Vermont legislature. And of course, we all know that that the Democrats and progressives together won a supermajority in the legislature. And really, we hoped that this, from the environmental community's perspective, that this would change the political dynamic in the state house, where previously, with the vote count, the governor was essentially able to a large extent, dictate the agenda of what was possible, because any veto could be upheld by the Republican caucus. And so by changing that political dynamic and taking away some of that power of the governor's office to essentially decide what was or was not possible, we really were optimistic and hopeful heading into the legislative session. We also saw things like this Boston Globe article talking about how in Vermont, a progressive haven, that emissions report showing that our greenhouse gas emissions were actually rising, not falling, as we all kind of felt like they should be, based on all the work that we knew was happening in the state, that kind of extra push for this kind of more national attention on the need for climate action. And there were some really positive things coming out this year. So early in the session, we were seeing a lot of energy and building up of the Legislative Climate Solutions Caucus. This is a group of legislators committed to climate action. They meet weekly to strategize and put forward an agenda and try to advocate for that together. This caucus has grown to 82 members, and that's really exciting to see that kind of work. We also saw, as Joey mentioned, some of these really exciting freshman lawmakers who had come in running on climate action, and so we knew that there was this energy, enthusiasm, and even expertise of people who work in the clean energy field that were now legislators themselves helping to push for action. Even the cohort of freshmen were making their voices heard, saying, you know, I ran on climate action and really want to be pushing forward with bold solutions. So all of that was really exciting to see. We also, as Joey briefly touched on, saw really more climate activism at the State House than I've ever seen before, from starting on day one of the legislative session with climate activists calling for bold change, to a number of youth-led events, the climate strike, the youth lobby day. We saw the marchers from Middlebury. There were CEOs that came out, ski industry leaders. So all these different voices coming out to the State House calling for bold climate action. So here were the marchers from Middlebury. There was the youth lobby day. So all of these positive dynamics, I think, are really worth noting. I think they're important. I think they give us things to build on heading into 2020 and beyond. And so just want to take a moment to celebrate all that hard work that went into it. And I think it is changing the dynamics at the State House. And, you know, again, we know that, as Ben and Joey both described, the actual policy outcomes that we saw this year, the investments that lawmakers chose to do, you know, fell short of what we had called for and are not, you know, what it will take to put us on track to meeting our own goals. You know, and it's challenging for all of us who care deeply about this issue, because we know that often policy does happen incrementally. And so, and for most issues, you can celebrate incremental change. I think it's fair and understandable that our current leaders are out there celebrating the work that was done. We have more investments in weatherization, in electric vehicles, and so on. And so I think, you know, there's a little bit of tension between, well, we're doing good things, and then those of us looking at the science and the urgency are looking at through the lens of, we don't have time to take small incremental steps. We need to ramp up the scope of what we're putting forward through policy, through state investments, and do it quickly. And I think part of the challenge has been a lack of leadership from the top, and I'm not talking about the mayor of Burlington. This is an event where Governor Scott came out and pledged his ongoing support to the Paris Climate Accord, and this was great to see that we have a Republican governor, staying on track and saying good things about the need for climate action. At the same time, seeing the work that was done throughout the legislative session in mid-May, the governor was saying, quote, "We're doing what we can in terms of climate change." So we're not seeing, bold leadership coming out of that office in terms of really transforming our energy system and taking dramatic steps to deal with this issue. Additionally, early on in the session, we were really encouraged to see Speaker of the House Mitzi Johnson on day one of the session say, quote, "Climate change continues to threaten our economy and the Vermont way of life. We cannot ignore the opportunity to make progress on an issue that will have lasting impact on generations to come." Similarly, Senator Tim Ashe, the Senate President, stood with us at the launch of our climate action plan early in the session. So we saw this commitment, we saw this this acknowledgement that climate action needs to be part of what we're working on in the legislature. What we ran up against, though, by the middle of the session, you can see on the right-hand part of your screen the whole host of priorities. And so, every year there's a whole lot of ideas of policies that legislators want to work on, and there was a lot of focus this year, for example, on minimum wage and paid family leave as top tier issues for many lawmakers. And so climate change became, one of many things people were working on, and a lot of attention on other priorities meant that climate action was not at the top of the list for really any of the leaders in the State House. So to me, I think one part of our collective work for the summer and fall is to ensure that all of us are working in our communities with our friends and neighbors, building support with lawmakers across the state to be calling on leadership, making sure that climate action is the top priority in the 2020 legislative session. So when we see those next lists of leadership priorities, that climate change is right up there, so we can be taking the kinds of steps that we need. And I think that there's a lot of national momentum we're seeing on this. This slide shows a poll where, for the first time ever, climate action is an issue that's rising to the top of concerns for voters. And this kind of information and data, and we're feeling that with this increased activism and energy that we're seeing at the State House. So building on that, us knowing that climate action is a winning political issue, and together we believe that and know that, and we need to be working with our lawmakers so that they know that and they feel that heading into 2020, into the legislative session, and knowing that there's an election coming up. If people feel that climate action is expected of them when they are in the State House, that will help us accomplish the more bold policies that we need. There are a few things that we're asking for in the short term to help build this kind of support. One thing you could think about doing is an end of session letter to the editor in your local paper, acknowledging the start, acknowledging that we're pointed in the right direction on climate change, but that we need to really ramp up the state policies and the investments that we're making to truly bend the curve on climate pollution. And if anyone is interested and willing to do this, any of us on this webinar would happily work with you on language and working through how you make that happen. We are also, BCV and some allies are going to be offering candidate trainings in the fall. So if you or anyone you know might be interested in participating, either if you're thinking of running for office yourself as a climate champ in 2020, or you want to help work on the campaigns of pro-climate candidates, it's a great way to get skills and tools and connect with other like-minded folks. So look out for word on that. And again, just connecting with your lawmakers locally to make sure that they're hearing about this issue and that they're hearing the call for the type of action that we need at the State House to really be getting on track to meeting our climate goals. So again, where we landed, we're pointed in the right direction, but we need to do far more to be on track to meet our statutory greenhouse gas emission goals that we have. The figures on the right just underscore how much work we have to do. And all of that work, of course, is huge economic opportunity, as we know. And so all of us together need to work with our lawmakers this summer and fall to ensure that climate action is a top priority heading into the 2020 legislative session, so that we are given the space to pursue the policies and investments to put us on track to meet our climate commitments.
So just about to wrap up in term, so you've heard a reflection from the three of us, acknowledging that we did take some important steps forward this session, but the magnitude of what is actually required to meet our commitments, commitments that we have because of, again, the urgency of climate, but also as a significant opportunity. And that's the way that we're looking at it, as a job creating opportunity, getting off of the imported fossil fuels that we rely on so heavily, and helping all of our friends and neighbors, including the most vulnerable among us, have access to clean, local, more affordable energy into the future. So this is a look back at the 2019 session, but with far more to do, we're also looking forward. And we've begun to speak that process of thinking about what we need to do, what kinds of policies we look forward to pushing with you and others. One fundamental first step we believe is to enact something like our neighbors in Massachusetts and other states like Connecticut have enacted. It's called the Global Warming Solutions Act, but what it fundamentally is an accountability metric for saying that we're serious about our climate commitments. And for Vermont, it would say that we're serious about getting to our 2006 statutory greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. It is not a prescriptive framework. It doesn't tell us exactly what we need to be doing, but it does set a framework for action. It puts the state's Agency of Natural Resources in charge of a process to work with other agencies and to identify key stakeholders and different solutions that will actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Again, doing so in an equitable and affordable way. A bill was introduced in both the House and the Senate in the Vermont legislature that would follow Massachusetts' lead and is a Global Warming Solutions Act, again, being a fundamental important first step. The bills would establish rulemaking and biannual status reports, as well as a public process to ensure progress, creating things like enforcement mechanisms under the Attorney General, and also creating the ability to bring a civil suit to force progress, not monetary dollars, but progress towards those goals. So a really important fundamental framework. So that's really a key priority for us that we look forward to pushing with you and others and working with legislators and others to advance this upcoming session. But that's likely not all we're going to need to be doing, and we're going to be looking forward to doing some outreach with you all and getting into communities and regions to make more progress. So that's just a sort of a note to say this isn't the end of the conversation, it's the beginning of a look forward towards 2020 and beyond, but also asking you to mark your calendar for September 20th to 27th, September 20th in particular, which is the global climate strike that leaders like 350.org and others are organizing across the world. Efforts and events will be happening here in Vermont, so stay tuned. Also to put on your radar, this Transportation and Climate Initiative. This is an initiative to look at a cap and invest program for the transportation sector in the Northeast to really move the needle in greenhouse gas emission reductions in our most carbon intensive sector, transportation, in partnership with other states in the region. So this effort is underway. There is a webinar on it on June 20th. If you want to learn more about that initiative, we are involved. We'd love you to be involved too, ideally to make it, if it's moving forward, as strong as possible. But there will be some public events. Also, Lauren, we all noted the Climate Solutions Caucus and the important leadership happening in that increasingly engaged legislative body. It does sound like very few details, but there's interest among Climate Solutions Caucus leaders to engage with Vermonters in their communities, potentially in partnership with town energy committees or others. So stay tuned for some potential partnership and outreach opportunities in your community or in a region near you. But the long and the short of it is lots more work to do. We'll be working as a coalition of groups to try and identify a set of couple to a few shared really key priorities to move forward in 2020 and then set the stage for far more progress, job creation, equity, ensuring progress in climate and clean energy. So I know several of you have had questions, and we are going to get to a few of them. And I would ask, someone was asking about the Green New Deal. What, if anything, is happening related to a Green Mountain New Deal? And what's the potential? Ben?
Sure. So I'd say, and I think reasonable people can disagree on this, but Green New Deal is more messaging frame than a particular policy. I mean, if you actually look at the resolution in DC, it's a set of goals and criteria, not particular legislation. So here in Vermont, I would see the components of a Green New Deal being a lot of the stuff that we're talking about. Mobilizing the clean energy and efficiency sectors to get more high-paying jobs in those sectors. We just saw that we actually lost, in the most recent report that came out this week, lost jobs again in the renewable energy space this year. So the weatherization, the Global Warming Solutions Act, moving to 100% renewable energy. These are the components of a Green New Deal. Whether or not legislators decide to package stuff up as a Green New Deal, that's, I think, an open question. But I would argue that, if you look at the components of what would go into that, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about over the next several years.
Excellent. Thanks, Ben. A couple of you have asked questions along the lines of, to achieve our goals, we're going to need upfront capital and investment. It's not enough to make progress through small but important budgetary appropriations. The question is, what kinds of creative financing and funding solutions are being considered? It's a really good question, and as many of you on this webinar might know, it's a question that the three organizations hosting this webinar have been exploring for a while in terms of looking at an economy-wide price on carbon pollution in the unregulated heating and transportation sectors in particular, because the long and the short of it is we don't have the levers that we need to be pulling in those sectors like we have in the electric sector. The electric sector has made significant progress. They're on track to meeting their goals, and they're helping Vermonters save money and doing good by doing right. We don't have that same kind of mechanism in the heating and transportation sector, but it has been incredibly challenging to, while many bills have been introduced to look at putting a price on carbon pollution or a cap and invest program, there really hasn't been a tremendous amount of appetite politically yet for doing something along those lines. but revenue will have to be raised and in some way to help Vermonters make the kind of investment that's going to be needed, and looking at it as an investment in ourselves and in the future and not as a cost equation singular, I think could be helpful. And other things like integrating the social cost of carbon into decision making, some of these ideas are really on the table, and not trying to evade the question, but there are some bills still on the table, and Ben can tell you a little bit more.
So I'd also just add, it seems to me that that question's getting at a little bit of the question of like funding versus financing, as in like the state spending money on grants versus banks or other entities, whether it's the state or the private sector, loaning money, financing. And the reality there is, to a significant degree, the money's available. It's just whether or not we're actually freeing it up to spend on these kinds of things. So for instance, in the weatherization space, the moderate income weatherization that we were talking about, some funding going to through Efficiency Vermont, they're going to be able to spend about $2.6 million over the next year or so on moderate income weatherization. That's going to go into things like incentives to prompt people to weatherize their homes. It's going to go into things like buying down the interest rates on private financing that comes from third-party banks or credit unions. So the state putting in some money, the idea is that that spurs a lot more investment in the private sector. That's certainly, largely in this country how we've seen renewable energy get built out, energy efficiency happen to a significant degree. So that's not to say that things like freeing up some state dollars that the treasurer controls, for instance, isn't a good idea. That there has been some action on that. That a green bank isn't something that could be looked at in the future. Certainly there are other creative ideas out there from a financing standpoint, but from our perspective, the biggest nut that we need to crack is the funding and regulations that will free up the capital that's already out there in the world to be spent on climate and clean energy action.
A couple other questions. Someone asked a very fair and appropriate question about if we're concerned about celebrating and potentially greenwashing the success of what happened this legislative session and our progress to date. And from my perspective, and others please weigh in, I would just simply say that is a legitimate concern. But one of the things that it would be really helpful, I think, for all of us who really want to see progress made is to put it in the context of our goals and what's going to be required. And I just want to harken back to what we shared with you in terms of what we've committed to here in this slide, in terms of committing to Paris, what our current pace, creates, and what we've done this past session. So there's a wide gulf, and I think it's really important for us to have a shared set of metrics and an accountability framework, which is again what the Global Warming Solutions Act is, to try and get away from that challenge.
One thing I would add, this is Lauren, is I think it kind of cuts both ways, because I do actually take it as a positive sign that a lot of our leaders are wanting to celebrate. They're talking about climate action. They're talking about the work that was done this year. And I think that reflects all the work that activists and others did in and the advocacy community in pushing for bold climate action. So the fact that they're out there talking about what happened is a starting point, and we do need to absolutely make the case that we need policies and investments commensurate with the kind of work that we need to do to actually get on track. And that's the work that we'll have to do and walk that line of the messaging. But I think we can take it as a small sign of hope that they actually feel the need to be out there talking about what happened on climate this year. So I'll just leave it at that for now. I know there's a lot of other questions.
There are a couple of you have asked about sort of the big sort of quote unquote failure or dashed hopes and expectations at the end of the session. I guess what I would say is mostly that despite a strong platform and some sort of solidarity with the Senate President and others early in the session, it became pretty clear early on in the session that climate and clean energy progress was not a top tier priority. And so our expectations were were recalibrated early in the session. I think at the end of the session, the dashed hopes and expectations really were around the minimum wage and paid family leave bill and some really important other priorities that really fell to the wayside. But I think our hopes were dashed as well. But to the point that we're trying to make here is just giving you a sense of what actually was accomplished and setting the stage for making much greater progress in line with what we have committed to. So needing solutions, again, commensurate with what's required. And ideally, we're not back here with you next June with more dashed expectations, but instead we've enacted some very, very strong policy framework.
One thing that we've been talking about as organizations is sort of narrowing the playing field, that we've kind of been putting out this menu of, here are a number of things that we need to do. And that's something that kind of comes naturally in the climate space because there is so much to do. But we also are recognizing that, oftentimes the sort of human nature is to find the cheapest thing on the menu, so to speak, the sort of the lowest hanging fruit and go for that. And that leaves some of the bigger actions undone. I know this is something that Lauren and I have talked a lot about. Do you want to delve into that theme a little bit more?
Sure. So, we've been trying to learn from what happened this session. And I think, in retrospect, knowing that we had put forward a climate action plan with 6 different asks, I think it ended up being a little confusing to legislators. I think it gave, different people were focused on different asks, and it made it hard to gel around, okay, if we do X policy or do a big investment in one thing, that is the kind of action that is going to be celebrated. It felt more like they were hearing different things that all kinds of different people wanted, and it made it harder to focus and easier for them to throw up their hands and say, we don't even know what you want exactly. And so I think, as we all, as people who want to see climate action strategize for moving forward, to the extent that we can all be clearly rowing in the same direction and having a clear call to action and what we're going to be holding people accountable to, I think that would help provide clarity to lawmakers and our own networks and all that of what exactly are we calling for, and how can we make sure that we can measure success more clearly for ourselves too.
A couple of you, just knowing we only have one minute left, somebody asked about September 20th, more details about that. That planning is in the works. There are no details yet to share. All of our organizations will be deeply engaged. 350 Vermont is helping to lead the charge. So just stay tuned to us. Make sure that you're signed up for our newsletters, and we will certainly be communicating and wanting to engage with you, but no details yet. Someone asked about how we also tackling behavior change. It's a tough topic to drive politically, but it is certainly essential to making progress. But it's, again, one of the reasons several of our organizations have been calling for putting a price on carbon pollution, because the goal with any measure like that is to disincent the things that you want people to use less of, like dirty imported fossil fuels, and incent the things that you want people to do more of, which is invest in clean energy with the dollars raised, reduce income tax or sales tax or property tax. So that's a really tough question to answer, but other things like the plastics progress that was made this legislative session, I think are hopeful steps. And as we noted throughout this entire webinar, while progress made, still insufficient. So,
and I would just add to that, I mean, a lot of what we were thinking about heading into this session is how are we providing support to people who we know across Vermont, consistently from our work in communities around the state, people want to be getting to cleaner energy sources. They just need help doing that. And when it comes down to, you're making your calculation for your family budget and your pocketbook, how are we providing incentives and other things that change that calculus for people so they can make the investments and get the and buy into the clean energy economy, which is what we want people to do. So that's been a big part of the conversation.
Yeah. So recognizing that we are out of time, we will do our best to answer any specific questions that any of you had that we did not answer. Please feel free to reach out to any of us individually as well. You can find our contact information at our websites, Vermont Natural Resources Council, VPIRG, Vermont Conservation Voters. We know many of you. We are grateful for the partnership that you provide us, and most importantly, we're going to really look forward to working with you, your friends, your neighbors, as many Vermonters as possible, to set the stage for the kind of progress that we need in 2020 and far beyond. So this is the beginning of the conversation. We hope we'll do more webinars. Please do check out our climate dispatch that we brought you every Friday from the legislature, and we'll do with partners over the course of the summer and the fall as well. Stay tuned for more information about September 20th, potentially a fall roadshow, transportation and climate initiative, engagement opportunities, and lots more. So this is just to say gratitude for you joining us on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Hope you get your lunch in, and we look forward to being in touch another time soon. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.